you've achieved Gurmila Magrev to us or Ben Justin Downta, August an Curvor Mayo Joe, August an Krishta Topton Shaw, Arish, August Bemiana Hoppiger Fata Sulagum, Gumeminis Luna Quidno Mediog. One of the great achievements I think, Joe, you've done in Glenties is that I seem to be the exception this year. I seem to be the only one using PowerPoint, which is the plague of so many people's lives. So, and when you don't have PowerPoint ready, you've just got to fill up. You're there. Let me start off by saying what is the title of my piece, and I promised Don I will do something. What I didn't tell Don was that I've never finished a speech in 15 minutes. But today I am going to finish in 15 minutes, and I know you'll be very glad to hear that. All right. I titled my piece today, Learning Must Embrace Our Imaginative Tradition. And the reason I entitled it that is because I'm going to argue today that the great Irish advantage is imagination. And it is the only true human resource in the knowledge economy, in the knowledge society, in the learning age that we've all talked about today. And I'll start off with a quote. I'm giving the front page by a famous philosopher, education philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who said, "A university is imaginative or it is nothing." You could almost apply the same to other levels in the education system. And I'm reminded, I see Donald de Butler here, and I remember reading an article in Studies, I believe it was, Donald, years ago about the late Paddy Lynch of UCD, great economist who was responsible in many ways for the movement in the 50s which led to Whittaker and economic development. And the late Paddy Lynch used to use a phrase that he used to borrow or steal or take, whatever, from the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, which said, the problem with a utilitarian education is, now what was the rest of that quote, is that it's not utilitarian enough. And I'm going to argue today that the big mistake we make in education, especially at third level, which is where most of my academic career was spent, is that we focus too much on I won't say skills, but on structures, on content, on exams. Great, thanks very much. And that we should focus far more on nurturing the imagination, because it's the imagination which is the true, as I said earlier, resource. And I'm going to argue that in Ireland we have a particular advantage, which I'm going to argue also we don't use to our advantage, because we still think, irrespective of what these people said today, we still think, I think from a policy point of view, in an industrial age way of thinking. We do not think, if you will, in an innovation age, or as Martin said, in the sustainable age or the services age. We still think, even though we use very fancy words, we still think in this sort of industrial manufacturing age. And as I said, imagination is what I'm going to focus on, and you link between, if you will, the Irish mind, the global economy, globalization, if you will, and how education fits into that. If I can figure out how this goes forward. See the difference? Oh, yes. And I've laid out here, and I'm not going to go through each of them. I'll explain, or go through each section. I just want to explain what is the emerging era. And I'm repeating some of the things people said earlier, but just to clarify the point, that on the left-hand side, I called it the techno-economic paradigm. And I've spent many years as a professor of finance and in economics departments of various universities. And in many ways, we still think that way. We still think in this manufacturing age. I'm a bit presumptuous, but I call it logic being the masculine way of thinking. But you can see the terms I'm using: growth, rationality, independence, costs, seeing the organisation as a machine, bureaucracy, top-down. I know the answer. That was the old way of thinking. The manager knew what was the proper answer, and therefore the people working in the organisation followed those instructions. And I do a lot of work at the moment in major services companies like PayPal and various other companies. And in many ways, it's the right-hand side that is emerging now in those companies. Again, Martin emphasised that it's services ethic. I called it the imaginative mind, but I gave examples: digital media, global services, social networks. The mind, if you will, the way of thinking. What's the valuable resource in those types of industries are concepts, and I'm comparing growth, the old way of thinking, with development and well-being. The old way of thinking was rationality. The new way of thinking is emotions, feelings, aesthetics, identity. The old way of thinking was independence. Again, something Chris pointed out very much in his talk. The new concept is interdependence, cooperative networks. The old way of thinking, again, the economist way of thinking, the accounting way of thinking was about costs. The new one is relationships. I could keep on going. Now, I'm not going to argue that we've gone completely to the right-hand side. It's an emerging era. But I will say this, that it's in the interface in many ways between the two that the real creativity occurs. And in many ways, it's no wonder I put the word masculine logic on the left-hand side and put the word soul or feminine on the right-hand side. Because, and I have to say this in a delicate way, but we all know that creation comes from the two, comes from the interaction between the two. And if you're going to create or develop the real creative Irish mind, or the Irish education of the future, you've got to create an ethic which integrates in some way those two. Other people have said it in other ways. We talk about the scientific and the artistic. But it is very much this way of thinking. If you will, the rational and the irrational, the structured and the unstructured, order and disorder. That is the challenge in education. And it is a real challenge for educators to develop a sort of a milieu or a place where that sort of interaction occurs. And I tried to demonstrate it in a little diagram where we are at the moment and where I spend most of my time when I am developing innovative or creative cultures in these organizations. What I'm trying to do in many ways, if you see the big oval there, I captured, I gave terms that are oftentimes used interchangeably, perhaps not at the top noise, but certainly data, information and knowledge are oftentimes used interchangeably. And what I'm really saying is, as you go down the y-axis, as we used to call it, you're going deeper under the surface. The top, what I call the surface in many ways, is explicit. You can see it. You can put the knowledge on networks. You can put it on the computers. We can see it. It's outside. And what I put on the bottom underneath, going deeper in terms of meaning and identity and experience, I call understanding. Understanding has much more to do with valuing. Knowledge is much more to do with, if you will, acting on the knowledge. But it doesn't bring in values. It doesn't bring in the sort of things that many of our speakers talk to today. And wisdom. When you think about wisdom, which is a deeper form of learning and a deeper form of knowledge, and a much more valuable one, as I will argue in a few minutes, in terms of the market. And in a strange way, people don't really appreciate that. You will see that what is needed then is somehow to get deeper into the individual. It's about tacit knowledge. It's about transcendent knowledge, as I will show. And what I'm arguing is that we have, and you see the size of the two ovals, one is much bigger than the other. And the challenge is in many ways, and I don't disagree with anything Chris said when I say that when I circled the top one and called it scientific or economic way of thinking, going back to my techno-economic paradigm, what I'm saying is we need to in some way link that with the bottom one, which is to do with the arts, the humanities, and philosophy and theology. In many ways, the spiritual. So how do you integrate those? Again, it is this challenge. And as I said earlier, I will argue that policymakers in Ireland, Irish education, needs to address that. That is where the action is. That is where the future is. And I asked the question at the top, which I'm not going to answer today, but I think it's a provocative one. Given what I've said about knowledge and the difference between knowledge and understanding, I said, did people in the past, perhaps, know less but understand more? And the reason I'm saying that is because we're swamped now with knowledge and information. And what we need is more wisdom and understanding. Because if you don't have those in some way, in some sort of balance, you won't end up with the type of knowledge economy or knowledge society we all want. And I gave a quote, which I'm not going to read out, from T.S. Eliot about the link between information, knowledge and wisdom. And he said that 70 years ago. So what's my argument then? The most valuable learning, as I point out, is tacit and transcendent. The key resource is imagination. The key human resource is imagination. And I'm arguing that sense of place. And I was interested in what Don and Eddie Malloy said during the week about localism, perhaps too much localism. I'm not talking about local in that sense. I'm talking about a sense of where you come from, a sense of this place you dwell. And I defined it as shared meaning nurtured by experience. Again, this word of meaning and experience. How do you nurture that in education? And that's, I said, the basic elements of that is what drives inspiration, intuition, memory, belonging, purpose. All those deeper things I said were incredibly valuable. Morality. And a lot of our talks during this week have been about ethics and morality. So creative places of the future, whether they're cities, regions like this, countries, they have different, rare, inimitable, and valuable intangibles. And places that succeed are different, they're authentic, they have those and they're unique. People want to come to them, people want to visit them, people want to work in them, they want to raise their families in them. And the places of the future, and again this is a huge challenge for education, higher education in particular, how do you integrate, again going back to some of the things you said. The logic now is, or the direction is, special places attract special people. Unique places, different places. I was going to say strange places attract strange people. But it's strange people, in many ways, is what we do need in the innovation age. Strange people, whether they're scientists or artists. So, special places, and they create special jobs. So that is the logic. The old way of thinking was you built factories and you hoped that you developed a region or city or whatever by employing people who would then develop the region. The new paradigm, the new way of thinking in development is create special places or develop special places or keep things you have that are special and unique and distinctive. So local culture, I'm arguing, is more, not less, important with globalization. And this was the point we argued in our book that Don cited and linked it to Farmley. So places, countries, etc. compete on difference, being different, and having those valuable resources. And I gave some examples in terms of content. I talked about digital media. And as I said, as a former professor of finance, I've looked at how things are valued many times over the years. I used Bollywood. I was going to say Hollywood, which is also true, because culture is what drives and is distinctive about Hollywood. But I think Bollywood, we all know, it's because it's Indian. Nokia comes, in a sense, you can see the same logic. Nokia emerges from the Finnish mind when it comes to design and the link between design, style, understanding. And they understand themselves, perhaps, far more than we understand ourselves. And therefore, in many ways, that's why they've been able to develop such a wonderful international industry. I gave another example, originality. I say handcrafts. And God knows this region is a great example of having an industry at one stage that was quite distinctive. French fashion. French fashion is special and valuable because it's French. People know what it means. Or Swiss watches. We buy Swiss watches because they're Swiss. We know what it stands for. Local expertise like artisan foods, and I gave examples again there. Italian cuisine or Parmesan cheese. You link, if you will, the region, the place, with the mind of the place, or the culture of the place. So then, when we look at Ireland's potential, having argued that point, the essence of creativity is ambiguity. Now this, as they say, is strange, because ambiguity, ambivalence, paradox, fluidity, and disorder. And again, goodness knows we have enough of this in Ireland. But let me put it like this. It is an opportunity. And the reason I'm saying it's an opportunity is, if you look at what it is about thinking in two different ways, or seeing in some way inconsistencies or contradictions, and holding them in some sort of balance. And as again I say, I spend a lot of time in the organizations trying to do that. So I'm saying imagination, this resource that I've argued is incredibly valuable, it weakens conventional, you're trying to weaken conventional thought. You're trying to, in some way, weaken the traditional way of thinking. And I gave poetry and art as an example, which is very good at that. It helps people to, in a way, break the old way of thinking, because they're forced to reconsider, what is this thing all about? And in many ways, that is really what I would put far more emphasis in business on poetry and art, because I think it helps business students in particular understand and be imaginative. I emphasize not knowing rather than knowing. We tend to put too much emphasis on knowing something. In many ways, it's mystery is far more. Why? It's when students, young people in particular, I think, are asked questions of their parents oftentimes, and they can't answer them or won't answer them, don't know how to answer them, don't know the answers, that stimulates them, these young people, to go out and seek the answers. So not knowing oftentimes is more important than knowing. And I said seek contradiction, not not best practice. And I know the word best practice, or the term best practice, was probably used a lot this week. And again, this is not about one or the other, but best practice in many ways goes against this way of thinking, because what you're looking for is contradiction. And if you look at the whole innovation and sustainable development, it is about that. How do you create better products and services with less waste? Better and better. Not trade-offs, not one versus the other. So there's a contradiction, it seems. You mean more environmentally friendly, therefore less waste, and better, cheaper maybe. So it doesn't seem to make sense, but that is what stimulates innovation in this new. So I'm saying again, going back to some of the points earlier, it's a fusion of cultural and artistic conversation or inner discovery with the outer discovery, the rational, and getting those right. So I'm saying the opportunity is Ireland's imaginative tradition, and I'm giving examples, the ruptured roots, the fact that we lost our own language, or have almost lost it, I should point out. But in many ways, it is an opportunity to have those two traditions in some sort of conflict. One is global, one is local. One is about the outside, one is about the inside, about ourselves and the meaning. And it is about stimulating the two, if you will. It's not one versus the other. It's in some way combating or keeping these in contradiction and making the contradictions dance. And I gave some of James Joyce himself said, the great advantage of having two thinks at a time, or as Thomas Kinsella, the poet, said, the divided mind. Or as Declan Kybert of UCD said, or called it the title of his book, Idir Gá Chultúr. That is where the opportunity is. And to finish off, because I did promise, Don, and am I on time?
We'll give you a little bit of flex.
Well, don't give me too much flex, Don, because that is the rock you'll perish on, I can assure you. I have taken many advantages.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. I will say that the distinctive Irish resources then are the artistic and the analytical, the emotional, the rational, the disorder, the soul and the mind. And if Don had given me more time, I would have talked about the relationship between the poetic and the scientific by taking sense of place, where Seamus Heaney and the great natural scientist Robert Lloyd Prager, how they've both viewed, one as scientist, the other, if you will, looking at Dean Shanachus, the Irish tradition of place names, and both of them looking at, one as scientist and one, if you will, a literary person, looking at the same place, but two perspectives. So I'm saying the great Irish advantage, and I spend a lot of time in the organisations I work with, stimulating stories. That is, getting people to tell stories about their organisation, stories about their own lives. I'm saying the great advantage we have in our tradition and traditions, metaphors, folklore, storytelling, mythology, liminality, symbolic, the imaginative. I'm giving, and I gave a quote there showing that many ways what happens is we assume that because something isn't true, it isn't valuable. That is something very much that has come to the fore in the last couple of 100 years. Hopefully it'll disappear. And think of what I've just said. Something is not true, it's a story or it's made up, but it is at the same time oftentimes very valuable. And you only have to think of that, the knowledge in books. The stories aren't true, but they're very valuable in helping people to understand and to have wisdom, as I said earlier. So in many ways, what you want is to stimulate imagination through stories, through metaphor, and we have that. And that is why we need to stimulate it in the way, or in these structures we have. So the mystery, I said, and I started with this and I'll finish with this, is why don't we nurture such valuable resources? And the answer I gave it at the beginning, but I give it again, is that we tend to think in industrial age thinking still, rather than in this innovation or imaginative age. And I'm saying the action, as I said earlier, is to think global, but be rooted in Ireland. And the 1960s, I believe, is, well, the first revival, 1819 to 1920, which was, in many ways, the foundation of the state, is probably the best place to go back to. But a good friend of mine, John Fanning, who recently did a PhD in UCD, actually argued that the 1960s, the late 50s to the mid-60s, was also a time of great cultural self-confidence. He gave examples like the IDA, Chorus Tráchtáil at the time. And in many ways, I don't think we hear enough about the way people like T.K. Whittaker or Sean O'Riordan mediated through the prism of Irish culture, Irish tradition and culture. Development through that was the prism in which they looked at. And I think we need to reevaluate that. And if you want good examples, think of music. Irish music, the reason it's so successful is because it is local, because it's rooted in the local, but it's also global. And it's able to, in many ways, take the global and in some way bring in the global into the local. The Donegal fiddle tradition is a great example of that. Dance, river dance, I'm not going to that. Sport. Anybody who goes to Croke Park knows the reason Croke Park is such a success now is in many ways because it is local, but it's now global with soccer and rugby. I'm very grateful that I got so much time. I broke my own rule, but I hope you won't mind. Gurmil Malcolm.